Welcome to Libyth. Today we are in Heian, Japan, and today we have to start by admitting something that is going to feel, for a moment, like we are taking something away from you. There is no story in the Kokinshu. We told you this back in our first episode together, and we are not walking it back now. There is no protagonist moving through the world, no rising tension resolving into release, no hero crossing a threshold and returning changed. If you came into this episode expecting us to finally reveal the plot we have been withholding, we have to disappoint you immediately, cleanly, without apology, because that disappointment is actually the doorway into what this episode is for. The question we are going to ask today is not what happens in this book. The question is how this book is built. And it turns out that question is just as rich, just as revealing, just as capable of holding your attention for the better part of an hour as any plot summary could ever be. We just have to ask it properly. Start with the most basic structural fact about the collection, the fact that almost everything else in this episode is going to branch out from. The Kokinshu divides into two great halves, and the order of those halves tells you something immediately about what the compilers believed mattered most. The first half is built around the seasons. The second half is built around love. Not love and then seasons. Seasons and then love. The compilers, when they had to decide what the most important subject in Japanese poetry was, what deserved to open the anthology and set its initial tone, did not choose romance, did not choose human relationship, did not choose the human drama that a Western reader might instinctively expect to anchor a major literary collection. They chose the natural world. They chose the turning of the year. Love comes second, not because it mattered less in any simple sense, but because in the logic of this collection, the human emotional world is something that unfolds inside the seasonal world, nested within it, structured by it, rather than standing apart from it as its own separate domain. This is worth sitting with before we go any further, because it is already telling you something about the entire collection's worldview before we have looked at a single individual poem. Nature is not backdrop here. Nature is the larger structure that human feeling lives inside. Now let's walk through the actual 20-book architecture, because the order is not arbitrary, and once you see the logic, you will not be able to unsee it. The collection opens with 2 books of spring poetry, then moves to a single book of summer, then 2 books of autumn, then a single book of winter. That asymmetry alone is interesting. Spring and autumn each get double the space that summer and winter get, which tells you something about which seasonal transitions this poetic tradition found most emotionally generative. Spring, the moment of renewal, of blossoming, of fragile beauty, about to be lost almost as soon as it arrives. Autumn, the moment of decline, of color intensifying right before it disappears, of the year visibly beginning to die. Summer and winter, the seasons of stability, whether in fullness or in stillness, get comparatively little attention, because stability does not generate the kind of charged, poised on the edge emotional material this tradition is drawn to. The seasons that matter most here are the seasons of transition, the hinge points, the moments when one state is dissolving into another. We will come back to that observation later in this series, because it turns out to connect directly to the deepest philosophical claim buried in the anthology's prefaces. After the 4 seasonal books, the collection moves into a book of poems for felicitations, formal verses of congratulation and good wishes, the kind of poetry a courtier might be expected to produce for an official occasion. Then a book of partings, poems marking the moment of separation between people, often written as someone departs the capital. Then a book of travel, which we sampled directly back in our reading episode. Poems shadowed by displacement, written from inside unfamiliar territory, carrying the particular ache of distance from the only place that genuinely conferred social meaning. Then a single book given over to what gets called, somewhat dryly, the names of things, poems built around wordplay, around the names of particular objects or places used as a kind of poetic raw material. And only after all of that, after the seasons, after the formal social occasions, after travel and displacement, do we finally arrive at love, which occupies not one book, not two, but 5 full books, books 11 through 15, the single largest sustained topic in the entire collection. Notice the proportion here, because it is doing real argumentative work. 5 books out of 20, a full quarter of the entire anthology, devoted to a single topic, more space than the seasons collectively receive. This is the compilers telling you, through sheer structural weight, what they considered the emotional center of gravity for human experience once you move past the natural world itself. And then, after love, the collection moves into a book of laments, elegiac poems mourning the dead, before passing into a stretch of miscellaneous poems, poems in various unusual forms, and finally closing with a 20th book given over to ceremonial songs from the court's own Bureau of Poetry. The formal, institutional, ritual function the entire apparatus was always ultimately in service of. Pause on that ending for a moment, because it answers a question we should ask directly. Why does the collection end where it ends? It would be easy to imagine a different closing gesture, something more personal, something that left the reader on an intimate, individual note after the long emotional arc running from spring through love through loss. Instead, the anthology closes by returning explicitly to its own institutional origin, ceremonial court songs, music and verse produced for and by the apparatus of the state itself. The book that began as an emperor's commission ends by reminding you, formally, structurally, unmistakably, that it always was an emperor's commission. The personal, interior material, the seasons experienced individually, the love experienced individually, the loss experienced individually, gets folded back in the final movement into the collective, ceremonial, institutional function that authorized the entire project in the first place. The structure does not end on a private note. It ends on a public one. That is not incidental. It is the architecture telling you, in its very last gesture, what kind of object you have actually been reading the whole time. Now here is where the structure gets genuinely sophisticated, and where I want you to slow down with me, because this is the detail that separates the Kokinshu from simply being a long list of poems sorted into convenient bins. Within each of these 20 books, the poems are not arranged randomly, and they are not simply grouped by topic and left to sit beside each other without relationship. They are arranged in sequences, what the tradition itself calls shidai, sequences of poems on a shared subject that move through subtle variations in how that subject gets treated, poem after poem circling the same general territory while shifting angle, shifting emphasis, shifting emotional register slightly each time. Think of it less like an index, a simple catalog where you flip to the entry you need, and more like something closer to a carefully sequenced album, where the order of the tracks matters, where one piece sets up the emotional register that the next piece either extends or complicates, where the experience of moving through the sequence in order is meaningfully different from the experience of encountering any single poem in isolation. This is what makes the Kokinshu read, surprisingly, as something closer to a unified, coherent text, rather than simply a pile of independently excellent short poems that happen to share a cover. The architecture is doing compositional work. Someone, or more likely several someones working in close coordination, was thinking carefully about sequence, about how one poem's image or mood hands off to the next, building something that has genuine narrative momentum, even though it has no narrative content in the conventional sense. This brings us to a comparison that is going to sharpen everything we have just said, because it throws the Kokinshu's structural ambition into much clearer relief. A century and a half earlier, an older collection of Japanese poetry had already been assembled. The Manyoshu, the collection of 10,000 leaves, vastly larger than the Kokinshu, containing thousands of poems rather than roughly 1,100, and drawing from a much wider, much rougher cross-section of society, including poems attributed to soldiers, to minor officials, to figures well outside the upper aristocracy. The Manyoshu has no preface at all. None. It simply exists as a collection, offering no theoretical justification for its own existence, no explanation of what poetry is for, no ranking of which poets count as masters. It is, in its own way, a magnificent and sprawling document, closer in spirit to something gathered than something composed, closer to an accumulation of voices across a wide social range than to a single coherent editorial vision. Its values, to the extent scholars have characterized them, lean toward something the tradition calls makoto, sincerity or forthrightness, and a kind of masareaberry, a vigorous, almost masculine directness, poetry that often says more plainly and at greater length what it means, willing to extend itself across more lines, more syllables, more explicit statement, to get its full meaning across. The Kokinshu is doing something close to the opposite, and once you see the contrast, you understand what the Kokinshu's compilers were actually choosing when they built their own collection the way they built it. Where the Manyoshu sprawls, the Kokinshu compresses. Where the Manyoshu draws from a wide social range, the Kokinshu curates exclusively from within and for the court. Where the Manyoshu has no theoretical apparatus at all, the Kokinshu opens with not one but two prefaces, essays explaining and justifying the entire poetic tradition the collection claims to represent. And where the Manyoshu favors directness, plain statement extended across more syllables when needed, the Kokinshu favors precision, the maximum possible compression of meaning into the smallest possible verbal space, prizing the discipline of saying less and meaning more over the impulse to simply say everything that needs to be said. This is not poetry becoming less sophisticated over the century and a half, separating these two collections. It is poetry becoming more disciplined, more architecturally self-aware, more interested in what can be achieved through restraint and arrangement than through sheer accumulated volume. And this formal evolution tracks an even deeper shift, one we touched on briefly in our very first episode and need to return to properly here, because it belongs squarely inside the question of structure. The writing system itself was changing underneath these two collections. The Manyoshu was composed using a system called manyagana, Chinese characters borrowed and used purely for their sound value, an ingenious but cumbersome workaround for representing a language, Japanese, that had no native script of its own when writing first arrived from the continent. By the time of the Kokinshu, that cumbersome workaround had begun crystallizing into something more elegant, more genuinely native. Kana, a true phonetic syllabary, capable of representing Japanese speech directly rather than through the borrowed, repurposed shell of Chinese characters. The Kokinshu sits almost exactly at the hinge point of that transition, The moment Japanese literary culture tips from borrowed Chinese script being awkwardly repurposed into a script that finally belongs entirely to the language it is recording. That is not a minor technical footnote. It is part of why the Kokinshu could achieve the structural sophistication we have just walked through. The careful sequencing, the deliberate compression, the theoretical self-justification in the prefaces. Because for the first time, the writing system itself was flexible enough, native enough, to support that level of compositional ambition in the vernacular language rather than only in borrowed Chinese forms. Which brings us to the two prefaces themselves, because they are, in their own right, a structural statement, sitting at the very front of the collection before a single poem has appeared. One preface, the mana preface, is written in Chinese, authored by a court official named Kaino Yashimachi, addressing the collection in the prestige language of formal scholarship and administration. The other, the kana preface, is written in the Japanese vernacular script, authored by Kai no Tsuruyuki, the same Tsuruyuki who served as chief among the four compilers. Two languages, two registers of authority, deliberately placed side by side at the threshold of the same official, imperially sanctioned text. Read structurally, this is the collection making a claim about its own legitimacy from two directions simultaneously. Yes, this work belongs to the established prestige tradition of formal scholarship. Here is the Chinese preface to prove it. And also, this work stands entirely on its own, as a fully realized literary tradition in the native language, deserving its own theoretical justification on its own terms. Here is the kana preface to prove that too. The bilingual framing is not redundant. It is doing two different kinds of legitimating work at once, claiming standing in both literary worlds the Heian court actually inhabited. Now consider what this entire elaborate structure, the seasonal architecture moving through transition points, the sequenced books building toward love and then mourning before resolving into ceremony, the two prefaces claiming dual legitimacy, what it deliberately leaves out, because absence is structure too, and the silences in this collection are as carefully maintained as its presences. Remember everything we walked through 2 episodes ago, the marriage politics, the regency mechanism, the slow conversion of public land into private tax-exempt estates, the entire structural tension straining underneath Heian court society at exactly the moment this anthology was being compiled. None of that appears here. Not once, not obliquely, not in code. There is no poem about a regent. There is no poem about a tax-exempt estate. There is no poem registering, even indirectly, the specific political anxieties of the moment of its own composition. The anthology that we now know, having spent an entire episode mapping the structural tensions of its world, was produced inside a court actively losing its grip on substantive administrative power, contains almost no trace of that loss expressed as political content. What it contains instead, in staggering abundance, is loss expressed as natural and emotional content. The falling blossom, the fading color, the parting traveler, the grieving lover, the lament for the dead. It is almost as though the entire register of political and economic instability we spent an episode excavating has been translated, wholesale, into a different vocabulary entirely. The vocabulary of season and feeling, with the original political content stripped out and only its emotional shape, transience, loss, the ache of impermanence, retained and intensified. We are not going to resolve that observation today, because it belongs properly to a later episode, where we sit directly with what the prefaces claim poetry is actually for. But it is worth planting here, inside our discussion of structure, because it is itself a structural fact. The architecture of this collection is built to hold an enormous amount of feeling about loss and transition, while almost entirely excluding the specific, nameable political and material causes of loss and transition that were actually operating in the world its compilers lived in. That is a choice, even if it was never consciously framed as one. A structure that processes instability through nature and feeling rather than through politics and economics is still a structure making a decision about what gets to be the proper subject of poetry and what does not. So when we ask, as we promised at the start of this episode, how this book is built rather than what happens in it, here is the answer we have arrived at together. It is built as a year that becomes a life. It opens with the seasons, the largest, most impersonal structure available, the turning of the natural world that contains and outlasts any individual human experience. It moves inward from there into the most intimate, most individually felt structure available, love, given more structural weight than any other single subject in the entire collection. It moves through loss, through lament, through the various and miscellaneous overflow that does not fit neatly into the major categories. And it closes by folding all of that personal, seasonal, emotional material back into the formal, ceremonial, institutional function that authorized the whole project from the very beginning. Spring to winter. Love to mourning. Private feeling back into public ritual. That is the shape of the book. It is not a story. It is something else, something closer to a single, enormously elaborate structural argument about how a human life moves through time, dressed in the borrowed clothing of a year's seasons. And you cannot see that argument if you keep waiting for a plot to arrive. You can only see it once you stop waiting and start looking, instead, at how everything has been placed. That's all for today on Libyth. One new book every week. At least we try.